Hello, daydreamers. My name is Hamza.
I'm Chandler, and welcome to Daydreaming Duality. What are we talking about today, Hamza?
Well, if people have read the title, they should know. Should humanity kill itself? And
This is
the
this is a bit dark right out the gate, isn't it? It's a Tuesday night, tail end of March. We're coming right up on April Fool's Day, and you're asking if the whole species should just go and die.
well, so it's kind of fitting for a Tuesday.
Yesterday was Monday, Hamza. Wouldn't a Monday be a better? Never mind. I don't want to mess with the schedule.
Well,
Go
Monday's more of a
ahead.
downhill spiral, but this is
Oh, I
peak.
see.
This is peak downhill right now on a Tuesday.
Oh, okay, I see.
Uh,
So
uh,
so the deceleration just can't get any faster except on a Tuesday.
all right. So the premise for today's podcast comes out of
Acceleration, pardon.
comes
Got
out
it.
of this short video I watched by Solar Suns, I believe is the name of the YouTuber, and their video was called anti-natalism, and uh, it's titled "Voluntary Extinction." Highly suggest checking him out. Great YouTuber. But essentially, he talks about this idea that kind of like picked up my brain a little, and it's called anti-natalism. For those who are wondering what is anti-natalism, it's pretty simple. Uh, some of you might know what natalism is, and that's the act or that's the idea of giving birth, right? Is that right? Uh,
It's got the word natal in it.
exactly.
I'm not
Root
familiar with the
words.
term directly, but I'm sure if we Google it really quickly, it sounds like it would be something that would be an argument in favor of procreation.
Yep, yep. And so on the other end of the extreme, you have anti-natalism, and
Oh,
what's up?
no, I'm with you. We have anti-natalism. So I've just pulled this up for our lovely viewers. You don't have to go Google this yourself. I've pulled it up.
Nice.
Natalism is the pro-birth position. It's a belief that promotes the reproduction of human life, and in many cases, it's considered sort of the natural stance, less societal constraints. But let's see, what is anti-natalism then?
It's the exact opposite of what you just said.
Oh
Uh,
no,
but with a little more flavoring on top, I would say.
we got
So,
sprinkles. Okay.
so anti-natalism, as opposed to natalism, it's all about not procreating and not having kids. And the thing about anti-natalism is that there is a reason attached behind it. That reason being is creation procreates. Uh, ooh, I just lost the word. Oh, sorry, misery. There we go. So it's all about, human suffering and human misery are a result of humans being born in the first place. So if humans aren't born, voila, no more misery and pain and suffering. And so that's the stance antinatalism comes from. And you
There's
know,
got to be a lot more to it than that, Hamza. That seems very, very cut and dry.
uh, to be honest with you, there isn't much more to it. It's that simple. It's the so antinatalism. It does get wrapped into being child free, and a lot of people take it as a thing where, oh, I don't want kids, I'm an anti-natalist. That might not necessarily be true. Pure anti-natalism concerns itself with the misery of a person that is brought into this world, and of course there are layers to it. You can peel it away like an onion, but at the core of it, it's all about not bringing more humans to as to lower the total sum of the misery that would come about in this universe.
Okay, so this is one of those arguments. It's staggered amusingly. So this is the same kind of argument that comes up when it's time for people to vote, and I don't want to drag us down the political pipeline too far. So, pardon me for the analogy, but I just want to make sure you understand.
Uh
There's
huh.
sort of two stances which exist when it comes to voting. One which commands people to vote because the net difference is the thing that matters, and one which permits in some cases a command not to vote because total negative impact is what matters. And so some people will resign or refuse to vote on the from the stance that because they can guarantee that there will be non-zero net change, sorry, non-zero, non-positive net change. They can't guarantee that that will happen, that there will be some positive or at least break even. They can't guarantee that. They refuse to vote outright because it would be contrary to their belief that they would be contributing something negative to the world by voting. By choosing a lesser of two evils, they are necessarily choosing an evil, and that is something that they would object to outright. The other camp says virtually the opposite, which is, how could you in any frame of mind consider that the lesser of two evils isn't the better choice when you're presented with two options? The lesser of two evils minimizes the impact of evil, even in situations where the lesser of two evil will still be evil.
Wow.
And so these two stances are what come to mind when you describe this to me. Because human suffering exists, in order to get human suffering to zero, well, the only way to succeed in doing this, according to this theory that you've put forward, or this philosophy that you've put forward, would be for there to be no humans to suffer.
Uh, yeah, that is actually pretty spot on. That is actually surprisingly spot on. After, doing my research, I did not stumble upon that analogy. It could possibly the first analogy being made between the two, but it kind of sums it up pretty nicely. Also,
That's impressive.
I I,
Okay.
I do want to add to it that a lot of people mistake anti-natalism for being nihilistic, and
No, it doesn't seem it. So nihilism suggests that there's no inherent point in anything.
mhm,
Um, but this doesn't seem to suggest that there's no inherent point in anything as a precondition for it. Um, it seems it almost seems like it would be establishing a purpose. The current purpose of this generation and the living generation left would be to prevent another generation from coming into being. It establishes a
mhm,
species-wide purpose.
yeah.
So it's very anti-nihilist.
Exactly, yeah, and a lot of people tend to like in their conversation be like, "Oh, I'm anti-natalist and I'm nihilistic about everything." It's like, no, no, and I think there is some confusion going on. It's more akin to pessimism,
Mm-hmm.
glass half empty kind of deal, uh, versus nihilism, where there there is no point to the glass being full or empty or half empty or whatever. And I just wanted to put that out there that in no way, shape, or form is this nihilistic.
Okay, so the goal of the philosophy is to end human suffering using currently available means, I guess.
Uh,
Doesn't strive for a future that may have superior means for ending human suffering, or nor does it acknowledge alternative means for ending human suffering.
well, so at the core of it, it's like the idea is that no matter how much positivity you can bring into a person's life, the negativity will be equal to or even outweigh it. Uh, of course, that is not to say that one person might not just live a fantastical life, but his, you know, good life might not be enough to cancel out all the bad lives everyone else has lived.
So sometimes I like to dance with extremes. I know they're extraordinarily unrealistic, but they're the edge cases that tend to fight edge cases. When
Mm-hmm.
you run into an edge case, sometimes you beat it down with another. Now, I'm not suggesting that what I have here could be of any value to you, but what does this theory suggest about a universe in which the human ability to suffer is physically, biologically, chemically removed from humans?
Wow, okay, that is definitely an edge case. I feel like, so is this a future scenario or is this an existing scenario?
This would definitely be something that would require research and mass adoption, probably. But it would be compatible with the end goal here.
Actually, you know what? This actually plays into nicely into one of the four things that a deeper dives into, and I think anti-natalism would actually reject this idea, simply because there's a term called isolation within anti-natalism, right? And isolation refers to the idea of shielding. We have a little kid, and of course, you're not going to start talking about suicides and death and all the suffering the kid will experience in his life, right? you'll wait for the kid to mature and understand how the world works. So isolation is the idea that you're shielding that kid from the pains and the truth of
By preventing its birth.
yeah. So uh the best form of stopping suffering is just not to have that kid in the first place, and that's what anti-natalism says. uh but yeah.
It's really interesting.
So
It's difficult for me to imagine this being something that would be accepted species wide, but in the event that it were, there's a few more edge cases that we have to consider. So this isolation, is this a principle which antinatalism seeks to uphold? Isolation?
let me pull it up here in my notes because I wrote down shorthanded, but I think I need the longhand to explain this properly. Let's
That's fine. You,
see
you pull that
here.
up, but I'm going to go ahead and frame what it is that I'm asking a little bit better than that. I'm trying to determine whether or not isolation is a goal or something which it seeks to prevent.
Which is seeks to prevent. So these four items, and I'll gently go through them, but
Please.
they're actually proposed by Peter Wessel Zeff, and I'm guessing it doesn't say specifically what Zeff does, but I'm gonna assume he's some kind of philosopher. Oh, or actually an author. And essentially, he identifies four repressive mechanisms we use uh, to restrict consciousness of life, is how it is described.
Okay.
And
What are
so,
these four mechanisms?
yeah, so isolation is the idea that, to stop people from feeling like there is no need to be born, is isolation, where, you just don't tell them the truth of the world right away. You wait for them to mature and, come into misery by themselves before you're revealed, like, oh yeah, this thing kind of sucks, right? Another thing people use is anchoring, which is essentially, your worldly possessions, which kind of help you tie to this reality, whether you want to be or not. Third is distraction. We've all had those days where we're like, I can't go on, but that new game is coming out, and so that would be an example of distraction. And sublimation, uh, turning your tragedies into a feel-good story.
That's an interesting one. Sublimation is turning your distractions, not your distractions, your disasters into feel-good stories.
Hmm. And
That's an
so,
interesting thing. Okay. So these are four things, and what did you call them?
so they're repressive mechanisms we use to restrict our consciousness of life in the world. Essentially,
Okay.
this is how we stop ourselves from thinking about antinatalism. Uh, so these are basically the defense mechanisms we use, whether consciously or unconsciously, to not fall into antinatalism.
And so what is Zap? Is that his name? Zap?
That's his last name. Yep, Peter
Okay.
Wessel Zeff.
Does this individual describe whether or not these defense, or what did you call them, repression mechanisms?
Repressive mechanisms, yes.
Repressive mechanisms. Does he describe that these repressive mechanisms are desirable? Does he simply state that they are, or does he suggest that we should be doing our best to dismantle them?
It's so the way it's worded, it's almost like these are ways that we justify the suffering, that we justify bringing life into this world, and how we cope with. So basically, these are coping mechanisms to the misery of reality. Essentially, is the best way
Sure,
to see
but
them.
as I'm sure you know from psychology, coping mechanisms can be a very good thing for the mental health of the individual that may be undergoing significant duress. So that's why I'm trying to pin down what this, I guess, philosopher's idea about them is. Is it the philosopher has simply described that they are, as a scientist might? Is it that he has suggested that these are things which we should work to remove? Is it that he is suggesting that these are things which we should encourage people to employ? What is his goal with outlining them?
Oh, sorry. So I think I should preface this, and I totally missed out on my notes here. I had it written down. But essentially, let's see here. What is the best way to put this? So these four repressive mechanisms come from the idea, and this is what anti-natalists tend to believe, is that we do not perceive reality accurately. So falling in line with that, these are the things we use or enforce to warp our sense of reality, where we make it seem like there's more good than bad in the world.
Interesting. So it really is from a pessimist tradition then that suggests that there is more bad than good in the world from the get-go and accepts that, or rather assumes that this is the case and then takes it upon itself to attempt to dismantle opposing ideologies as being counter to the assumption. So it's an axiomatic disagreement. It's not something which is in middle ground. So how have others considered this particular mentality and philosophy that might be a bit more neutral?
I think there is no neutrality to this philosophy of anti-natalism. Um, it's pretty straightforward and pretty head-on in the way it's structured, where suffering is the ultimate human experience, essentially, and to stop that suffering, we should just all stop having babies.
Okay, so let me ask some more probing questions about this philosophy. I'm really glad that you've got notes and that you've done research on this because it lets me poke and prod. So let me ask you, is there a dichotomy in the literature surrounding this that is something like either everything is suffering or it's a delusion to cover up suffering?
uh,
Is that dichotomy present in the thinking?
I rephrase the question, please.
Okay, I'll try to ask it a different way.
Uh huh.
Is there sort of an all or nothing, it's this or that kind of statement that goes something to the effect of everything is suffering and anyone who says otherwise is delusional?
Yes, that's exactly it.
That's unfalsifiable. So I already have a really big problem with that for the same reason that I have a problem with Ayn Rand's egocentrism.
See, but so anti-natalism has a big issue with natalism itself, and I think to a degree, and I kind of like almost agree with it. But one of the key points to anti-natalism, another key point I should add, is that consent cannot be given to birth someone. Like you cannot ask a baby and be like, "Hey, you want to come
Oh, I
into this
feel where
world?
this is going.
You want to come into this world?" Uh, the baby cannot say, "Yeah, sure," or "No way, Jose." There is no way to gain consent to bring someone into this world. So it is the ultimate consent breaker.
So
The
this
act of
this must be
birthing.
sort of a Kantian appeal then, right? Like it's a categorical imperative they're trying to set up, using the formulation that you cannot use another person as a means to an end, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, you
Since
could
they
say.
cannot consent to a life of their choosing ahead of their existence, then you are, by virtue of bringing them into the world, using them as a means, but not an end unto themselves, that sort of thing.
Yeah, pretty much
Well, let
actually.
me let me correct a misunderstanding with that philosophy then, because Immanuel Kant is really, really specific in how he formulates things. And his universal the universal formula, not the universal, the means formalization of the categorical imperative is meant to apply exclusively to rational agents. And according to our understanding of psychology and our understanding of the development of the human brain, it's not safe to say that a natal human is necessarily a rational agent yet.
Whoa, that takes us down another rabbit hole. I wonder if
This
you realize
isn't
that.
this isn't to dissuade any of the metaphysics that would describe that the soul may or may not have that ability, because if we support the notion that there is a soul which has rationality and that soul enters into an agreement with its deities and those deities encourage you to have kids, then any argument that suggests that individuals so moved by the spirit to have children are in fact having a child which has consented to be born. So we have to be very careful. If we choose to allow the metaphysics undoes the question. If we don't allow the metaphysics, then we have to acknowledge exclusively what isn't metaphysical.
Oh, I'd love to get into the metaphysical because I feel like there is like some religious doctrine that I personally believe in that goes directly opposite of antinatalism and its philosophies. But before I get onto that, Aristotle asked a very interesting question, which I also saw, and it was and they asked, I wonder if antinatalists also agree with abortion. if they think that you cannot do something to something that can't consent. So that's an interesting question. And there, funny enough,
That's rough.
there's actually
That's a really big wrench.
there's actually an answer to that.
Oh yeah,
There is, yeah.
what's that?
So so most people with so I wouldn't say all anti-natalists, right? That would be a false proposition conjecture. But most anti-natalists see it that, you know, if a fetus has yet to develop its pain sensors, right, it is okay to abort. But once the
Why?
fetus, because the act of abortion itself would increase that suffering. You
Is
see?
it the no, not quite, and I'm going to try.
Yeah,
Is it the
yeah.
pain receptors which are necessary for the suffering, or is it the central nervous system's development which is necessary for the suffering?
So, ooh, that's a good one. And you know, it doesn't clarify on that.
There's a good reason I ask that question, because that same logic connects back to the idea of the development of rationality and the applicability of the rational requirement of the categorical imperative as formalized by Immanuel Kant, right?
Okay, so
So
this got me curious. What is
they're
Kant's
connected. If you want
perspective?
to make them consistent, then we have to employ some slightly different rules.
All right, so take me on to Kant's journey. Would a fetus be considered a, you know, an actual thing?
Based on my current understanding, no.
Okay, okay.
Until the child is of an age where it is capable of behaving as any rational agent would, it is not capable of it doesn't gain that classification. Its behavior and its ability grant it the classification when it gets to that position. And from lifespan growth and development, if you were to look at the development of an individual, you're looking at an age range of somewhere between 10 and 13 roughly before the brain is at the point where rational thought kicks in really, really hard. And so, what Kant, and I'm paraphrasing really badly here, and I may actually be misquoting, and it could be someone else that I'm quoting, come to think of it. So I feel bad offering this with confidence, but please take it under the assumption that I haven't made a mistake and will correct mistakes in the future if I've made one.
Hmm.
But he would almost argue that it would be the responsibility of the parents to safeguard that life until that life is capable of becoming rational, so that that rational life, now being rational, can begin to decide for itself what it must do and what can be done for its own sake.
Wow, that sounds like isolation to me, but okay.
You see, that's the problem that I wanted to bring up earlier when we called it unfalsifiable. So let me dive down Ayn Rand's
Sure,
logic for a
sure.
moment. In Ayn Rand's world of egocentrism, everything is done for selfish reasons. Every decision you make and have ever made is selfish.
Hmm.
Always has been, always will be. Same for all people. Those that pretend it's selflessness are, in fact, doing an ethical wrong because they are not acting in their own interest. Or they are fooling themselves into thinking that they're acting against their own interest, except to say that they're acting in the interest of wanting to feel better by pretending to be selfless. Do you see the trickery there? No matter how you try to frame it, it's going to be selfish. There's no way around it. You cannot present to Ayn Rand's egocentrism any proposition of human behavior which cannot be backwards, sort of backwards. How do I say this? Deconstructed and rebuilt in such a way that it would suddenly become a selfish proposition. So all propositions are selfish from the perspective of human behavior and human interaction. I have a huge problem with this. Not because I want to be considered selfless, but because if there's no way for me to make a statement that isn't selfish, what has that philosophy done to advance anything?
Um, I have a
It
simple.
doesn't bring anything new to the conversation.
I have a solution for that.
Go ahead.
Anti-natalism.
Well, that's great, Hamza. I'm glad that letting us all die the slow, painful death without kids alone by ourselves in
Oh,
proper
so
isolation is your solution to the
so
problem.
it's funny you bring that up, because the idea there's also another idea behind that. It's generally said that it's better to have a slow, painful, suffering death, for the last few, than to have continued suffering for God knows how long.
What is this, anti-utilitarianism now? My goodness, are you just taking all of the philosophies that we could have talked about up to this point and turning them on their heads and saying, well, if we look at it upside down, the natural consequence is suicide. Uh, this is really interesting. I'm kind of enjoying this. So
Yeah.
let's pick at this a little bit more then. If it's got an anti-utilitarianism flair to it, then it must have sort of an equivalent to the hedonic calculus. Now, in utilitarianism, the hedonic calculus is that measure that they hand wavingly use behind the scenes to measure relative happiness, or relative joy, relative pleasure. And later versions of utilitarianism break that into lower pleasures and greater pleasures. Does anti-natalism's anti-utilitarianism make a distinction between lower suffering and greater suffering?
No. So I don't think there is a clear distinction between lower and greater suffering. Uh,
Why not? They're clearly different levels of suffering, right?
it's the whole
Is
point.
stubbing my toe the same as causing someone to live an 80-year life of suffering, the same level of suffering?
So, from my very surface level understanding of antinatalism, and I do not want to irk those that do believe in it genuinely. I would say yes.
Ooh, that's harsh. That's the same kind of logic that sort of Christian theologians would use to suggest that a lie is just as evil as intentional genocide in the eyes of God, right? It's a very harsh critique. I'm not sure that I accept it on at face value. Part of my reason for saying that, though, is because it turns the argument on its head again. Because then the life of an individual, or so the suffering of a life of an individual, has sort of infinite negativity, and the life of the suffering of a species has infinite negativity. And since the humans are discrete, that means they're countably infinite. So, since an individual's life experiences are continuous, and as a result uncountably infinite, then the suffering of an individual that is alive is by cardinality greater than the suffering of the species, which is sort of discretized. This is me being very hand wavy. You can probably poke a couple holes in my sophistry
Mm-hmm.
if you'd like, and I encourage you to do so. But for the moment, that to me would tell me that antinatalism's natural conclusion shouldn't be the slow death of the species, because the existing lives which do suffer continuously. And that continuity means their suffering is greater than the lives which haven't been brought into existence. And
Well,
so, no amount of suffering saved by preventing the existing of those lives lessens the infinite suffering of those that would die the slow death.
but if you continue to have kids, then the suffering is exponentially infinite.
Nonsense. Infinity times infinity to the power of infinity is.
But then you have sequenced infinities.
It doesn't matter. We're not in a position to compare those things, because once you get into those sorts of cardinalities, they sort of bleed into one another and keep to themselves unless they're jumping categories. And you don't jump them categories without being extraordinarily clever about your
So,
constructions.
so my counter argument to that would be that you can have two infinities, right? And they can be totally separate. So by so this to speak in favor of antinatalism for a moment.
Sure, go for it. That's your
Uh,
whole stance today.
so yeah, so it is. But yeah, just so the slow suffering of the last few that did not have kids, that are the last survivors of humanity, right? So
Mhm.
an argument could be met that yes, their suffering is infinite, but uh, their suffering is not the same as the suffering of those that would have been born, that would have continued to live, that would have had children. And so you can essentially have stacks of infinity, but each infinity is different because each suffering was a little different.
Uh-oh, I've got another problem.
Uh-huh.
How does antinatalism take into consideration the suffering of species which may evolve sapience and higher levels of intelligence later?
You,
Humans out of the way, something else will take our place, yes?
well, if antinatalism is the way to go, then those species will also realize that to end all suffering, they must eliminate themselves. So,
Supposing they don't come to that conclusion because they have a completely different basis for thinking that precludes these sort of unfalsifiable philosophies from being primary approaches to existence, and as a result don't consider that this is the correct answer, how should we, as the last remnant of humanity, act in order to ensure suffering in the universe is minimized?
so that's the thing. You cannot. So one of the things about antinatalism, I feel like, is that it's all about not bringing new suffering into the world, right? Uh,
Right. So I'm not suggesting that we, commit animal genocide or commit plant
yeah,
genocide.
and you can't.
I'm I'm suggesting instead that perhaps it might be a natural conclusion of antinatalism that we should in some way sterilize all organic life in the universe before we breathe our last breath.
Hmm. That's a tall order because
It is a tall order. Guess what we'll need to do that?
belief that the universe exists only because you exist.
No, at least one more generation of humans to get to the singularity so that we can so that we can have the reach necessary to pull off a feat like that. Certainly
Uh,
not something we could do in this generation alone.
so I don't think there is any sense. So the thing with antinatalism, I feel like the last few will just have to believe that whatever species arises will have enough understanding to come to the same conclusion they did.
That's a
And
lot of faith to put in a species that may or may not think entirely different fundamentally.
because the problem with eliminating all suffering in the universe is that you have to consider that due to the speed of light, some parts of the universe have just become inaccessible to us altogether. So even if we had the ability to sterilize any species we came across in an instance, right, and to travel at the speed of light, we would still not be fast enough to end all suffering in the universe.
In other words, you're telling me there's going to be infinite suffering in the universe regardless of whether the antinatalists get their way?
But there won't be human suffering.
There won't be human suffering. Now, what happens if the theory is correct that the universe is actually boundless and as a result infinite? And because in infinite universes, humanity will appear again in some way, shape, or form because it's not statistically forbidden, and in fact, because it's possible, it will happen in eventuality in an infinite plane. Um,
And
what
that
is to be said about that far-reaching humanity?
God
And
truly hated
because
us.
hmm?
God truly hated us.
So hold on, before we dive away from antinatalism with a remark like that, let's just take a moment to realize that because of the statement that I've just made, it's also guaranteed statistically in such an infinite universe that a version of humanity will come to exist that does not accept antinatalist reasoning. That version of humanity will continue to suffer because they do not accept the conclusions that the antinatalists have accepted, and they will be unreachable by the continuous expansion of the universe.
Those sad fools.
As a result, there will still be infinite human suffering in the universe. What has antinatalism accomplished?
The end of our specific genetic. Uh,
A pocket of suffering was stopped, but it's an infinitely growing pocket of suffering, and the removal of one node is not necessarily sufficient to prevent this hyper exponential growth that they fear.
well, we stopped our exponential growth.
Our exponential growth is extraordinarily local. I'm not convinced that antinatalists should be doing anything other than gathering in a small island somewhere to enjoy their last meals together, knowing that their pocket of reality is without suffering, despite the fact that other humans on Earth are still suffering. If that is an acceptable argument to be made.
Well, if you truly do go out on the goal of ending all suffering, then you become kind of anti-natalist at that point. Or sorry, anti-natalist.
Anti-natalist. So antinatalism only cares about also our small pocket. So why our small pocket and why not a subset of our small pocket?
Because then that would be considered eugenics and possibly genocide.
Not if it's opted into and self-selected, intentionally and willfully with full consent of all participating parties.
See, that's the problem with genocide. I feel like that's how it all starts.
Well, no, I'm not suggesting that we should round them up. I'm suggesting that if they strongly believe that this is the right path, that they should take the actions necessary to live out the life that they've chosen to live authentically, as an existentialist should. And given that they argue for a subjective reality, that is, a version of reality which is not objectively linked, um, how should I say this? They're already borrowing from Jean-Paul Sartre's book, and as a result, they are inherently in the sort of existentialist camp. Are you still with me?
Yeah, I'm still here with you. It does
Looks like we're
seem,
having some network trouble.
as always.
That's okay. The recording isn't dead if you're still with me.
Yeah, no,
So
the recording goes on. There is no end to that, and pretty soon we should be up live everywhere. Where you're,
I believe it. I'll leave
please,
the network management in your capable hands. But that's more to the point, isn't it? The if you take the subjective reality stance, you're inheriting existential ideology,
mm-hmm.
and one of the elements of existential ideology is the notion that you should live authentically to the purposes that you've chosen. If you should choose an anti-natalist purpose, then you as an individual ought to live authentically towards that end. That end being the limiting of human suffering within the realm of influence that you have with respect for the rational agents that disagree with you. The
That
consequence of this is that it seems most reasonable that the antinatalists that wish to fulfill this particular reality ought to gather together, or otherwise virtually gather together, in an effort to end their collection of suffering that they perceive. But if they should take any action against any other person outside of their consent, then they are violating the principles of suffering which they state they're trying to prevent violation of in the birth of children, and would be hypocrites as a result.
yeah, yeah. So anti-natalism, essentially, you cannot bring suffering onto others. Is, well, I would say, one of their core tenets, if it were a
If an
religion.
individual is coping with this notion of suffering and chooses, in order to maximize what they believe to be a lack of suffering through a natalist perspective, wouldn't that be um, something which would be acceptable from an antinatalist perspective?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
That was really clumsily worded, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I'll try to ask it a little bit differently. Suppose
Mm-hmm.
suppose that you're an antinatalist.
Okay. Yeah.
Suppose that I am not an antinatalist, and the choices that I've made in life steer me away from that philosophy, perhaps to the point of having children. Now, I don't think that's really something that I aim to do in the near future,
Mm-mm.
or at all for that matter. Um, but suppose that that were a direction that I should choose to go. Should you have any ability to stop me?
I would say no.
Okay. Then antinatalism is a self-defeating philosophy as well, because it cannot act. And if it did act, it would be hypocritical.
Oh yeah, yeah. So funny enough, there have been anti-natalist cults in the past, right? You want to know what happened to all of them?
They probably died.
Yeah, they died out.
What a beautiful philosophy. It gets rid of its own practitioners. That's horrible.
So here's
I
something
mean,
interesting I
I
stumbled
respect
upon.
that they believe that they've minimized suffering inside of their circles, but goodness gracious.
Negative utilitarianism.
Yeah. Well, I called it anti-utilitarianism earlier, didn't I?
Yeah.
So is it actually a formalized philosophy, this negative utilitarianism?
It seems to be minimize suffering for the greater moral importance than maximizing happiness.
Yes, it's the same approach, but from the wrong angle, or not the wrong angle, but from the opposite angle.
Aristotle
It should be
says,
compatible with traditional utilitarianism in that sense in most circumstances, but I can see several situations where they would disagree. For the same reasons that our voters, our hypothetical voters from before, would disagree.
plus agree to disagree.
At least they can do that much, right? There's some degree of civility there.
Right. So,
So, should humanity kill itself was the question that we set out to answer tonight.
oh, are we approaching the end? Wow. I've had a
Well,
lot.
we've got about 15, 20
We
minutes
do have
here. So I
15.
guess at this point, if anyone has any particularly potent questions that they'd like to ask or suggestions that they'd like to give, it would be a good time to get those typed up. It looks like Eris Ariel has another comment here. This from the perspective of someone who used to hold this sort of philosophy. In some cases, it is a projection from trauma. They don't quite understand yet that while suffering like theirs is possible, it's not necessarily ubiquitous. Should I read that again?
No, I'm reading it and I'm breaking it down, and that seems to be a form of distraction.
Well, if you consider citing hasty generalization as a fallacy used by the philosophy to be a form of distraction, then I suppose it can't be helped. Distraction is necessary for the maintenance of its logical consistency.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that type of pessimism does come from a hasty generalization, doesn't it?
It
It
does. It
makes the
definitely
bold
does. Yeah.
assumption that all people suffer more than they will experience joy.
Okay. So that was a hasty generalization on your part. It's more along the lines that there is more human suffering, collectively, than there would be happiness.
I see. So it doesn't apply to individuals, only to the whole.
Yeah, yeah. Or else there's no point to it.
Well, I mean, if it applies to the whole, and if the individuals aren't necessarily interested in the whole, we have a bit of a conflict of interests, don't we?
Um, Possibly.
In any case, it seems a bit strange. The perspective is that there will be more net negative than there will be, or that the situation will be net negative on the collective.
Mm-hmm.
What efforts have they made to prove that it will be net negative on the whole, or is this an assumption of the theory?
I
And
would.
you've said it starts from a pessimistic root, so it sounds like an assumption of the theory,
It's
but I want to
it's
verify that.
it's definitely an assumption.
So, suppose that that assumption were challenged, and the end result of our species is a type of species which experiences boundless euphoria without suffering, and does so for two, three, 500,000 times longer than humanity's existed. Would that constitute a dismantling of those assumptions? It's an edge case, but it's conceivable based on our very, very first podcast on post scarcity.
Um. So I feel like at the core of it, to a true anti-natalist, that
Ooh,
argument.
careful there. That almost sounded like a true Scotsman fallacy. We want to dodge that one here. We don't want to call out the true antinatalists, right? Because there could be different subsets of the philosophy. So let's go again.
Okay. Look. So. Uh, there is suffering is the only reality to anti-natalist, and
That seems pretty bold to claim.
it is a pretty
Um,
bold statement, and I think a part of it comes from you know feeling like I would so some people and this and I want to be careful in the way I phrase it. Some people are not suicidal at all, right? But there exists a need, a wanting to not have been born in the first place, right?
in individuals that aren't suicidal,
Yes,
and all individuals.
not in all individuals. Some can have that shared, but I want to be careful in the way I phrase this. Essentially, ooh, I lost my train of thought. That's
It's
embarrassing.
I think I see what you're trying to set up, but that's go ahead.
Oh no, I legitimately lost my train of
It's
thought.
completely gone.
It is
So
gone.
you were
Oh.
you were aiming at the idea that we'll accept that not everyone experiences suicidal thoughts or
Mm-hmm.
experiences bouts of potent depression that would lead to those things, but there exist people who do not experience those things, which would experience a desire not to have been born. I think you are going to go from there to posit that because an individual can regret birth, the individual should have had an option not to have been born, and because they did not have that option not to have been born, perhaps it was a wrong of the parents to introduce them into the world, whether or not that frame of mind was a lapse in judgment.
Exactly. That is it. Wow, you took the words right out of my mouth. But yes, that is exactly where I was headed.
It is tenuous, though, because it's built on existential generalizations, isn't it? It supposes that individuals like this exist, but it does not suggest that that particular experience is ubiquitous to the human experience, nor does it make any statements about how prevalent that particular experience is.
Yeah, and I think this its foundations are pretty weak, and I on that part I can totally agree with you. And just for all the listeners out there, I do want to state that I'm not anti-natalist by any means. It's we just wanted to have a fun discussion about it. Uh,
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah.
We're just kicking around an interesting new philosophy. I don't know how new it is really, but it's certainly the funny thing is I've had thoughts in this frame before. Part of the reason that I'm not so sure that I personally want kids goes back to my family history and the various medical anomalies which exist in my family. Now I won't detail any of
Mm-hmm.
them, but suffice to say, there are sufficiently many of them that without having significant genetic confirmation that an individual would be born free of those things, having a child of that kind wouldn't be something that I'd be willing to do. Does that mean I take adoption off the table? No. Does that mean I take developing an artificial intelligence so that Rokas Basculus doesn't torture me for eternity off the table? No. These are both forms of procreation, one human procreation and one species procreation, if I can put it that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And both of those are still on the table, and take advantage of situations. And I say take advantage, but understand I mean nothing malicious with no malicious connotations with that phrase. Take advantage of the fact that there are individuals that have kids that can't care for them, and so individuals who have a genetic background. And I don't want to dive into eugenics necessarily because this is self-selecting here. I'm not suggesting any policy which would globalize it or universalize it in any sense, but this is self-selecting. So if an individual like me could adopt in order to support a life that does exist instead of bringing one into the world which would be genetically predisposed to excessive suffering, this is on the verge of antinatalism, but it's not antinatalist because I'm saying nothing about individuals having kids. In fact, I'm supporting the kids that they've had.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it's a really delicate spot, and I can see where the logic shifts into an antinatist perspective. But it's difficult for me because the same logic that is Kant's categorical imperative that they've employed. Well, one of the other requirements of a formalization of a categorical imperative is the universalization response or requirement. That is to suggest that if it should be willed to be true, it should be willed such that every rational agent should also do such a thing without contradiction. Um, this is one of his requirements. So if we want to take the perspective that we can't have kids because that would be using humans as or using people as a means to an end, even though we've discredited whether we called into question whether or not those kids are rational agents at the
Mm-hmm.
point of birth in the first place. But moving that aside for a moment, suppose we accepted that we couldn't do it because it violated the second formalization. So let's come up with a new categorical imperative that arises from this naturally. Therefore, adults should not have children. Let me ask, is this universalizable? If all adults should choose not to have children, what would be the consequences? There would be significant economic failure. It would be requiring couples around the world to adhere to a philosophy which may, in some ways, disrupt their existing belief systems or disrupt their existing cultures. It would be something that would, in some way, conflict with the ambitions of individuals who may select for themselves an alternative path, and would be in that way disrupting their chosen path.
Yeah.
So is it universalizable to not have children? I don't think it is. So in the same way that having kids could fail the means to an end formalization requirement, the requirement or the postulate that we should have no kids also fails a requirement. It fails a universalizability requirement.
But wouldn't it be nice?
Wouldn't it be nice if there were no more children? Well, I'm sure a lot of people would be able to sleep more soundly at night without the children crying through the wall, or without having to worry about all of the diseases that spread in schools and infect society, and
All of
all of
them
those things. But there are
loitering
other solutions to these
on your
problems,
lawn.
things
On
like
your lawn.
distance education. Dare I say it?
Um. So yeah. Aristotle comes in. Let's see here. Uh, Naturally, not giving birth to someone will raise the possibility of suffering. But consider also that humans have a natural leaning towards procreation for survival. And while giving birth creates the possibility for suffering, it also creates the possibility for the species to advance. And they also add, and to be clear, I'm on neither of the sides of natalism arguments. And one more thing by Aracerium. All the things you can attribute to children, you can attribute to adults as well. Should we allow people to suffer until they die, or should everyone die for the same reason that we shouldn't have children? Um,
It's a really rough spot, isn't it? Because it almost requires antinatalism in order to minimize suffering, in order to go the full negative utilitarian route on the thing. It almost suggests that it would be the natural conclusion for everyone involved to at once engage in some kind of painless euthanasia.
yeah, yeah.
And by coordinating it all at once, they would mitigate the suffering of everyone around them. Oh wow, Eris Ariel just pops in Jonestown. Yeah, that's one of the greatest tragedies in the country's history, isn't it?
Was that the one with the
Jonestown.
Kool Aid?
Much like Waco, right?
Was it
What
big?
happens when unfalsifiable philosophies get carried away and taken seriously by people who can't work around the fact that it's unfalsifiable? Lots of death, lots of suffering, people who lose loved ones to those ideas. And another requirement that it would
If we,
have is, in order to go through with euthanasia, you would have to go through with it in the knowledge that everyone peripheral to you would also go through with it. Because if you do not have that requirement satisfied, then those people that knew you, and perhaps those people that knew you best that didn't go through with it, would suffer necessarily from your loss.
it's bizarre. It's definitely bizarre.
It's
It,
hard because it fails universal. It's an
it does.
unfalsifiable system that fails to universalize.
It definitely does, and it has a lot of kinks in it. Now, anti-natalism, it's actually not as recent as you might imagine, right? I think we've all had thoughts at some point as to why we shouldn't have kids.
Oh,
And
sure. I'm sure that this philosophy's been around for a very long
yeah,
time.
and the word itself actually originates from Greece, as a lot of English words do.
It's
But
not surprising. I mean, that's one of the, at this point, it's one of the foundations of scientific language, right? Latin and Greek are kind of the languages of academia, and have been for as long as the tradition of Western academia has existed, with
Mhm.
exception to perhaps the last 50, maybe 70 years.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much it. Uh, but I think it's a good goal to minimize all suffering. But
I think it's a good goal to have in conjunction with others. I don't think it's a good goal to consider a primary objective. And the reason I don't think it's a good primary objective is because it has the capacity to undo itself.
yeah,
In your desire to minimize suffering in all things, you will necessarily create suffering in some other way.
and it's definitely an extreme thought on its own. It definitely leans into that extreme of, hey, let's end all suffering right now, right? It's pretty much akin to, uh, you know, thinking of a solution being nuking the whole planet 10 times over, which we can totally do, and
Yeah,
would
easily, we could glass the planet and exterminate all existing life on it for the moment.
it'll be the best. Or sorry, not the best. It'll be the quickest way to go. Possibly the best way to go, depending on how close or far you are.
From the
Uh,
blast, or from the epicenter, yeah, because if you're not close enough, you get to die a death over anywhere from weeks to years from the radiation poisoning.
well, assuming we're glassing the planet over, the worst scenario would be you getting thrown up, 100 miles away and crashing into something.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, even then, like, even if you weren't tossed around to the point of dying from impact, if we glassed the world with nukes, we're talking about lifting the topsoil of the planet into the atmosphere and creating a dinosaur type extinction event where the light of the sun can't get down here, things get stupid cold, and everything else freezes off after the burn. So, unfortunately, humans aren't well, I can't say that. Didn't humans come to this continent in the first place using an ice age as covered across the land bridge between Alaska and Russia?
Yes, that's
So
that's how we got
ice
to a
ages
lot of
aren't our
places.
enemy.
I believe that's how we got to Australia at some point.
I have no idea how we got to Australia. It could have been the same as the Polynesian cultures that they just found a way to be seafaring and transplanted.
It's so cool how they can just travel the world in essentially what could be described as a little rowboat.
Well, I mean, they have the stars, right? And for as long, I mean, even today, we use something similar to the stars for the majority of our navigation. We created our own special radiation emitting stars that we call the global positioning system that we use to navigate. It's the same principle as navigation by starlight, except that we've removed some of the movement from the system in such a way that we can more readily triangulate our relative position on the surface according to that sort of swarm, right? We
Yeah.
created a closer constellation that we can more readily reach for triangulation. But you could still triangulate based on the constellations. And I think part of the reason we don't know the constellations by heart these days is kids. Maybe we know the Big Dipper, right? Maybe we can spot Ursa Minor out there, right? But most of us don't know the constellations because we don't need them. We don't need them to find our way back to our village. We don't need them to find our way back to our school. We don't need them for long distance travel on merchant trips. We don't need them for our naval trips really anymore. We don't need them because we have GPS.
Also,
We
light
have
pollution.
say again.
Light pollution. We can't actually see all of them anymore either.
Light pollution's removed a lot of them from the sky for us. We have highways with really detailed signs. Um, we have maps everywhere. Cartography's kind of removed the need for knowing the constellations.
If they kill their own
Um,
profession, possible.
it's not unnatural for that to occur. Um, I think Veritasium did a really good video on light bulbs recently.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't so recently, but it had to do with the agreement that various electrical giants made many, many, many years ago to include a sort of necessary obsolescence into the manufacture of light bulbs to stop them from becoming good enough that people wouldn't need to continue to buy them, so that they could continue to function as a business. Thank goodness for LED light bulbs today, right? They're
So so we are coming close to the end of the show for tonight. Uh,
Oh,
so
geez, we
so
are.
so let me ask you a question, Chandler, before we sign off.
Okay.
Should humanity kill itself? I don't know
I
if
don't
I've done
think
a good
so.
job. I'm
No,
gonna
I don't think
continue.
so. I'm not convinced. I think we've got a fighting chance. I think we've got a lot to live for. I think there are futures that we can pursue, which would be significantly better than, in mass, significantly better than the futures um, perceived by the pessimist stances. And I don't need to be an optimist to say that.
uh, Funny enough, I think there is a bit of convincing in me to this whole natalism thing. Um, but I don't think I could support it. I
It's so much fun though, isn't it?
It is
We
really
get
fun.
there's emotional persuasion that has to happen as well. And that was one of the really, really important points that Hume drove forward, is that we should consider these things. We should think about these things.
Oh yeah,
Not
yeah.
only as rationalists, but as people. And how do these things feel and impact us as individuals and as families? And so there's certainly something to be said. You feel that way. I'm not going to invalidate it. I will suggest that the rational foundation could use some work, and perhaps in some time you can come up with a better rational foundation for it. At that time, let's reconsider it.
Yeah. Uh, and with that, I guess it's time to end the show. You can catch
Oh
us.
goodness.
You can catch us weekly on Spotify. Not Spotify. pretty soon on Spotify, but you can catch us weekly on Twitch at 7:45 Central. And we should be posting on YouTube pretty soon, or we've already posted by the time you're listening, if you're lucky. And with that, my name is Hamza.
I'm Chandler. It's been really exciting daydreaming with you folks today, and we do hope to catch you next time.
Good night.